Welcome, friend, to another quiet journey through the shadows of ancient history. Whether you're settling in for the night or simply seeking refuge from the noise of the modern world, I'm grateful you found your way here. If this kind of gentle storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. What city? What country? What time zone you're calling home as we drift back through the centuries together? Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Pull your blankets a little closer. Let the day's worries fade like smoke in the evening air. Tonight, we're not traveling to golden palaces or walking with kings in their glory. No, tonight we're venturing into the forgotten corners of the ancient world, to places where hope was scarce and suffering was abundant. We're going to explore what it meant to live as one of the most feared and forsaken people in biblical times, the lepers. You've probably heard the word before, whispered in Sunday school lessons or glimpsed in scripture readings. But have you ever truly considered what it meant to wake up each morning knowing that your very presence could send entire crowds fleeing in terror? Have you imagined what it felt like to watch your own body slowly betray you piece by piece while the world you once knew grew further and further away? In our modern age of antibiotics and advanced medicine, it's difficult to comprehend the absolute horror that leprosy represented to people 2,000 years ago. We understand now that Hansen's disease, as it's properly called, is caused by a bacterial infection. We know it's barely contagious and entirely treatable. But to the people of biblical times, leprosy wasn't just a disease. It was a curse, a divine punishment, a living death that could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. The Hebrew word used in Scripture is tsara'at, and it encompassed far more than what we now recognize as leprosy. Any skin condition that appeared suspicious, any discoloration that seemed unnatural, any lesion that didn't heal properly could earn you that dreaded diagnosis. A rash that lingered too long, a patch of skin that lost its color, a sore that refused to close. Any of these could transform you overnight from a respected member of the community into an untouchable outcast. Picture, if you will, a young woman named Miriam living in a small village outside Jerusalem. She's 23 years old, newly married, with calloused hands from years of grinding grain and weaving cloth. Her life isn't easy. Few lives were in those days, but it's hers. She has a husband who cares for her, neighbors who greet her in the marketplace, a place in the world that feels solid and real. Then one morning, she notices a small pale patch on her forearm. At first, she dismisses it. Perhaps she scraped herself while carrying water, or maybe it's just a mark from too much sun. But days pass, and the patch doesn't fade. If anything, it seems to be growing, spreading like spilled milk across her olive skin. The dread begins as a whisper in her mind. She covers the spot with her sleeve, tells no one, prays desperately that it will disappear. But ancient communities were small, intimate places where secrets were nearly impossible to keep. Someone notices her pulling at her sleeves. A friend catches a glimpse of the discolored skin. Whispers begin to circulate. Have you seen Miriam's arm? Did you notice how she's been covering herself? My grandmother says that kind of mark means... The word hangs unspoken in the air, too terrible to voice. But everyone knows, everyone understands. And soon, the pressure becomes unbearable. The community elders approach her family. There's no choice, they explain, gently but firmly. She must be examined. The journey to see the priest feels like walking to her own execution. In biblical times, priests weren't just spiritual leaders. They were the medical authorities, the ones who determined whether a skin condition was merely unsightly or something far more sinister. They had detailed instructions, handed down through generations, describing exactly how to identify the dreaded Sara'at. The priest examines her carefully, comparing the lesion to the descriptions in the sacred texts. Is the hair in the affected area turning white? Does the skin appear to be deeper than the surrounding flesh? Has it spread since first noticed? These weren't just medical questions. They were determinations of fate. And when the priest speaks the words that seal her doom, "You are unclean," Miriam's old life ends as surely as if she had died. But death would be a mercy compared to what comes next. The rituals of separation begin immediately. Her clothes are burned. Her possessions are either destroyed or given away. Her hair is shaved, not in the careful, ceremonial way of religious observance, but roughly, quickly, as if every strand might carry contamination. She's given new garments, coarse, undyed cloth that marks her as an outcast. And then comes the most heartbreaking moment of all, the goodbye. Her husband cannot touch her. Her parents cannot embrace her. Her siblings must stand at a distance as she's led away from everything she's ever known. There are no last kisses, no final hugs, no gentle words of comfort. Contact with a leper, even the briefest touch, could render a person ritually unclean for days. And in a society where ritual purity determined your ability to work, worship, and participate in community life, contamination was a luxury no one could afford. Miriam is escorted to the outskirts of the village, beyond the last house, past the final field, to where the clean world ends and the realm of the unclean begins. Here she'll join others like herself, the forgotten ones, the cursed ones, the living dead. The leper colony, if it can even be called that, is nothing more than a collection of crude shelters built from scavenged stones and discarded wood. There are no proper houses here, no wells dug by the community, no roads maintained by local authorities. The lepers exist in a shadow world, technically still alive, but civilly dead, forgotten by the society that once claimed them as its own. Her first night is the longest of her life. The ground is hard beneath her thin mat. The wind cuts through the gaps in her makeshift shelter. But worse than the physical discomfort is the crushing weight of isolation. Just yesterday, she was part of a family, a community, a world that made sense. Tonight, she's utterly alone, cast out not just from her home but from humanity itself. The other lepers try to help as best they can. They show her where to find water, a muddy stream that the clean people would never drink from. They teach her which scraps of food might be safe to eat from the refuse piles outside the village. They explain the unwritten rules of their existence. Always announce your presence when clean people approach. Never come closer than 50 paces to anyone healthy. Always travel downwind so your breath won't contaminate others. But perhaps most importantly, they teach her the cry that will define the rest of her life. Unclean, unclean. The words she must shout whenever anyone approaches. A warning that echoes across the landscape, like the call of some mournful bird. It's a sound that makes children run to their mothers, and grown men change their paths. It's the voice of despair made audible, the sound of a human being reduced to a walking hazard. Days blur into weeks, weeks into months. Miriam learns to survive in this twilight existence. She discovers which merchants might, out of pity or greed, trade food for the small items she can scavenge. She finds out when the village throws away its refuse and learns to sort through it quickly before the dogs arrive. She masters the art of making herself invisible, of existing in the spaces between the normal world and nothingness. Her body continues its slow betrayal. The pale patches spread, multiplying like cruel stars across her skin. Her fingers begin to lose sensation. At first, just numbness, then a complete inability to feel heat or cold or pain. She burns herself on cooking fires without realizing it. She cuts herself on sharp stones without noticing until she sees the blood. Her body is becoming foreign to her, a stranger she's forced to inhabit. But it's not just the physical transformation that devastates her. It's the complete erasure of her identity. She's no longer Miriam the weaver, Miriam the wife, Miriam the daughter. She's simply the leper, a category, a condition, a walking contamination. Her name is forgotten, her history erased, her future reduced to a single terrible trajectory of decay and isolation. The religious implications make everything worse. In a society where physical wholeness was seen as a sign of divine favor, her condition marks her as cursed by God himself. Every morning when she wakes, she's reminded not just that her body is failing, but that she's been rejected by the Almighty. The priests who once blessed her now flee from her approach. The temple where she once worshipped is forever barred to her. She's cut off not just from human community, but from divine fellowship as well. And yet, somehow, life continues. The leper settlement develops its own rhythm, its own culture, its own desperate forms of hope. The outcasts form bonds with each other, relationships forged in shared suffering and mutual understanding. They tell stories to pass the long, empty hours. They share whatever food they can find. They tend to each other's wounds with the gentleness of those who know that no one else will. Some of the lepers have been there for years, their bodies so transformed by the disease that they barely look human anymore. Others are newcomers like Miriam, still adjusting to their exile, still mourning the lives they've lost. There are children too, either born to leper mothers or cast out when their own symptoms appeared. These children know no other world than this shadow existence. They've never played in village squares or learned trades from their fathers or celebrated festivals with their families. The seasons pass largely unnoticed in the leper colony. There are no harvest celebrations here, no wedding feasts, no religious festivals. Time is marked only by the slow progression of disease and the occasional death of a fellow outcast. When someone dies, the others do their best to bury them properly, though without priests or proper ceremonies. Even in death, the lepers remain cut off from the rituals that give meaning to human existence. Food is a constant struggle. The lepers survive on scraps, refuse, and whatever charity they can extract from the occasional sympathetic soul. Some villagers, moved by pity or religious duty, will leave small offerings of bread or dried fruit at designated spots where the lepers can collect them. But these gifts come with conditions. They're left at a distance, the givers fleeing before any contamination can occur. The lepers develop their own economy of sorts, trading skills and services among themselves. A former carpenter might build better shelters in exchange for food, gathered by those still able to walk long distances. A woman who once worked as a midwife might tend to the wounds of others in return for protection from the elements. It's a miniature society built on the margins of the real world, sustained by desperation and mutual dependence. But always, there's the awareness that they exist at the sufferance of the clean world. At any moment, the village authorities might decide they've come too close, that their very presence poses too great a risk. They could be driven further away, deeper into the wilderness, closer to the realm of wild animals and bandits. Their precarious existence depends entirely on remaining invisible enough to avoid persecution, but visible enough to occasionally receive charity. As we drift deeper into Miriam's story, as we follow her through the long, lonely months of exile, remember that her tale is not unique. Across the ancient world, in every village and city, there were others like her, people whose only crime was developing a skin condition that terrified their neighbours. Their names are lost to history, their voices silenced by centuries of dust and forgetting. But their suffering was real, their isolation complete, their hope as fragile as morning mist. The psychological toll of such existence defied comprehension. Imagine waking each dawn knowing that your very breath was considered poison, that your shadow was thought to carry contamination. Miriam learned to hate the sunrise, for each new day brought fresh reminders of what she had lost. The sound of laughter drifting from the village cut deeper than any physical pain. Children's voices at play, merchants calling their wares, the simple music of normal life, all of it now belonged to a world she could never re-enter. In the dead of night, when the village slept and the wind carried no human sounds, she would sometimes creep closer to the edge of her old life. Not close enough to be seen, never close enough to contaminate, but just near enough to catch glimpses of the world that had cast her out. She might see lamplight flickering through a familiar window, smell bread baking in ovens she once knew, hear a baby crying in arms that would never again hold her. These midnight vigils became a form of self-torture. Her husband had remarried within 6 months of her exile, a practical necessity, she told herself, though the knowledge felt like swallowing broken glass. The woman who now slept in her bed, cooked at her hearth, wore her jewellery, was younger, unblemished, ritually clean. Life had simply moved on without her, filling the space she had occupied as water fills the impression left by a stone. The other lepers warned her against these nocturnal wanderings. "The past is poison," old Samuel would wheeze through his ravaged throat. "It will eat you alive faster than any disease." Aincre. Samuel had been cast out 15 years earlier, and his body bore the full devastation of advanced leprosy. His fingers had shortened to stumps, his nose had collapsed, and his voice emerged as little more than a rasp. Yet his eyes still held intelligence, still carried the memory of the scholar he had once been. "I was writing commentary on the Psalms," he would tell the newer arrivals during the long, cold nights. 20 years of work, all left behind when they found the mark on my scalp. Sometimes I dream I'm still writing, that my hands still work, that words still flow from my pen like honey. His laugh was bitter as wormwood. Then I wake to this. But Samuel had also learned something that took Miriam months to understand. Survival required forgetting the person you used to be. The woman who had been a wife, a daughter, a valued member of the community, she had to die completely for the leper to live. Clinging to memories of the past was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. It would only slip away, leaving you emptier than before. The leper settlement operated by its own harsh logic. Those who were newly diagnosed, still clinging to hope of healing or return, were given the most dangerous tasks. Venturing closest to the village to gather supplies, approaching travellers who might spare a coin or crust of bread. Their desperation made them brave in ways that the veterans had learned to avoid. But it also made them useful. They could still pass for almost human from a distance. As the disease progressed, as faces became more obviously marked by its ravages, the afflicted moved deeper into the colony's hierarchy of concealment. They became the ones who stayed hidden during daylight hours, who emerged only under cover of darkness to tend fires or prepare what passed for meals. Their humanity became something to be hidden, rationed, revealed only to fellow sufferers who could look upon ruined faces without flinching. Miriam watched this progression with growing dread. Each morning, she examined her reflection in still water, cataloguing the changes. A new spot here, increased numbness there, the gradual thickening of her facial features that marked the disease's advance. She was becoming someone else, something else, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The children born into the colony broke her heart most completely. They knew no other world than this shadow existence, yet they still played as children do. They created games from scraps and stones, told stories passed down from the adults who remembered normal life and dreamed of adventures beyond their cursed boundaries. Their laughter was perhaps the most beautiful and terrible sound in the entire settlement, innocent joy blooming in the midst of ultimate despair. Little Ruth, born to a woman who had been cast out while pregnant, was 7 years old and had never seen the inside of a proper house. She made dolls from rags and sticks, hosted elaborate tea parties with empty bowls, and sang lullabies she had learned from her mother's fevered memories. When Miriam first arrived, Ruth had been among the first to approach her, offering a flower she had woven from grass stalks. "Welcome to our home," Ruth had said, with the grave courtesy of a child playing at adulthood. "It's not very pretty, but we try to keep it clean." The words had nearly broken Miriam's composure completely. This child, who would never know marriage or motherhood, or any of the simple pleasures of normal life, still spoke of keeping things clean, as if cleanliness had any meaning in their world of perpetual contamination. The adults in the colony had developed their own coping mechanisms, their own ways of finding meaning in meaninglessness. Some, like Samuel, lived in memories of their former lives, polishing old accomplishments like treasured coins. Others created elaborate fantasies of future healing, spinning tales of miraculous recoveries and triumphant returns to families who would welcome them with tears of joy. A few turned to bitter humor, making jokes about their condition that were funny only because the alternative was screaming. But perhaps the most remarkable were those who had discovered a strange form of peace in their exile. They spoke of being freed from the endless anxieties of normal life, the worry about crops and weather, the pressure to maintain social standing, the fear of divine judgment. "The worst thing that could happen to us already has," explained Deborah, a former merchant's wife, whose hands were now clawed and useless. "There's a terrible freedom in that knowledge." These were the ones who had learned to find beauty in small things. The way morning light fell across their crude shelters, the taste of clean water after rain, the warmth of a fire shared with fellow outcasts. They had discovered that even at the very bottom of human existence, life could still offer moments of grace. They were the colony's philosophers, its unlikely saints, living proof that the human spirit could survive even the complete destruction of everything that had once defined it. As months turned to years, Miriam began to understand what they meant. The constant grief for her lost life gradually gave way to something else. Not acceptance exactly, but a kind of exhausted peace. She stopped thinking of herself as someone temporarily displaced and began to understand that this was simply who she was now. The wife, the daughter, the respected member of the community, all of those identities had been as temporary as morning dew. This was her reality now, and she could either rage against it forever or find ways to make it bearable. She began to take on responsibilities within the colony. Her literacy, rare among the outcasts, made her valuable as a keeper of stories and traditions. She helped newer arrivals adjust to their exile, teaching them the unwritten rules of survival. She learned basic healing arts from those who had been cast out for decades, discovering that even here, in this place of ultimate sickness, there were still small ways to ease suffering. Most importantly, she began to understand that love had not disappeared from her world. It had simply taken different forms. The tenderness with which the colony's elders cared for its children, the way fellow sufferers shared their meager resources without being asked, the gentle patience shown to those whose minds had been broken by isolation, all of this was love, stripped of social convention and polite pretense, reduced to its most essential elements. When travelers passed near their settlement, Miriam had learned to call out the required warning without the crushing shame that had once accompanied it. "Unclean! Unclean!" The words still tasted like ashes, but they no longer felt like a denial of her humanity. They were simply a fact, like the color of the sky or the changing of the seasons. She was unclean according to the law, cast out according to custom, forgotten according to society's needs. But she was still alive, still capable of thought and feeling and connection with others who shared her fate. The nights were still the hardest. In darkness, when the sounds of normal life had faded and the colony settled into its restless sleep, the weight of isolation pressed down like a physical force. It was then that the magnitude of what they had lost became most clear. Not just health or social standing, but the basic human right to be seen, acknowledged, remembered as more than a walking contamination. Yet even in those darkest hours, there were small comforts. The warmth of a shared fire, the whispered stories of fellow outcasts, the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness, others like herself were awake and thinking similar thoughts. They were alone together, cut off from the world, but connected to each other by bonds forged in shared suffering and mutual understanding. And sometimes, very rarely, there were moments that approached something like joy. When little Ruth successfully wove a particularly intricate grass crown, when Samuel remembered a particularly beautiful passage from his abandoned scholarship, when the rains came and filled their crude cisterns with clean, sweet water. In these moments, life revealed that it could still offer gifts even to the utterly forsaken. These were not the grand happinesses of normal existence, marriage feasts, harvest celebrations, religious festivals. They were smaller, quieter, somehow more precious for their rarity. They were reminders that even here, at the very margins of human experience, the capacity for wonder had not been completely extinguished. As the seasons turned and years accumulated like dust in forgotten corners, Miriam learned that exile had its own rhythms, its own unexpected mercies. The settlement had grown during her time there, new faces arriving with that same look of stunned disbelief she once wore, their old lives still clinging to them like burial shrouds they hadn't yet learned to shed. She watched them arrive, these fresh casualties of divine judgment, or bacterial misfortune, depending on how you chose to see it. Each brought their own story of loss. The baker whose bread had fed half the village, until a white patch appeared on his cheek. The young mother whose infant was taken from her arms the moment the priest pronounced his verdict. The elderly scribe whose lifetime of copying sacred texts meant nothing once his skin began to mottle and change. The process was always the same. The examination, the pronouncement, the ritual separation from everything they had ever known. But Miriam had learned to see beyond the immediate devastation to something else. The strange resilience that emerged when there was literally nothing left to lose. It took months, sometimes years, but eventually most of them discovered what she had found. That being stripped of everything you thought defined you could reveal strengths you never knew existed. There was Benjamin, a former temple musician, whose scarred hands could no longer hold his beloved lyre. He had arrived 3 years after Miriam, weeping for the melodies he would never again play. But gradually, painfully, he had learned to make music with his voice alone, creating haunting songs that seemed to capture the very essence of their shared exile. His music became the colony's heartbeat, giving rhythm to their days and meaning to their suffering. And there was Naomi, once a wealthy merchant's daughter, who had never worked with her hands until leprosy stripped away her privilege along with her health. She discovered a gift for tending the sick that surpassed anything the colony had known before. Her gentle touch and intuitive understanding of pain made her their unofficial healer, the one they turned to when fever struck or wounds festered. She had found her calling in the last place anyone would think to look for it. The children especially taught lessons that the adults were slow to learn. They adapted with the fluid grace of youth, creating their own traditions and rituals that had nothing to do with the world that had rejected them. They developed secret languages, elaborate games, and fantastical stories about brave leper knights and beautiful princess outcasts. In their imagination, their condition became not a curse, but a mark of specialness, a sign that they were chosen for adventures ordinary children could never understand. Miriam often found herself marveling at their capacity for joy. Little Ruth, now 10 years old and wise beyond her years, had appointed herself the colony's official welcomer of newcomers. She would approach each terrified new arrival with a flower crown made of weeds and grass, offering it with the solemnity of a queen bestowing honours. "This means you belong here now," she would explain. And belonging somewhere is better than not belonging anywhere at all. The girl's simple wisdom cut straight to the heart of their existence. They were outcasts, yes, but they were outcasts together. They had formed their own society with its own rules, its own values, its own fierce loyalties. When one of them fell ill, truly ill, beyond even their modest abilities to help, the others gathered around with a tenderness that would have surprised the clean world that had cast them out. They held vigil, shared stories, and eased the dying into whatever came next with more grace than many received in proper deathbeds surrounded by family. The dead were buried in their own small cemetery just beyond the settlement's edge. There were no elaborate monuments, no carved epitaphs, but each grave was marked with stones, arranged in patterns that told stories only they could read. Here lay David the potter, whose clever hands had once shaped clay into vessels of startling beauty. There rested Sarah the teacher, who had continued instructing the colony's children until the day she died, ensuring that literacy and learning survived even here. These humble graves became sacred spaces in their own way, places where the living could commune with those who had completed their journey through exile. The colony observed its own calendar of remembrance, marking the anniversaries of deaths, with simple ceremonies that honored lives the outside world had long forgotten. They were the keepers of each other's memories, the only witnesses to the full humanity of those who had been reduced to walking contamination in the eyes of others. As Miriam's own condition progressed, as her hands grew more clumsy and her face more obviously marked, she found herself moving into the inner circles of the colony's hierarchy. She became one of the elders, the ones who made decisions and settled disputes, who held the community's accumulated wisdom and passed it on to newcomers. It was a position of respect she could never have imagined when she first arrived, broken and grieving for her lost life. The irony was not lost on her. In the clean world, she had been nobody special, a weaver's wife, a face in the crowd, one of hundreds of women who lived quiet lives of domestic routine. But here, among the forgotten and forsaken, she had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed. She had become a leader, a teacher, a keeper of stories and traditions that existed nowhere else on Earth. The settlement had its own culture now, its own ways of marking time and celebrating life despite everything. They observed the changing seasons with quiet rituals that acknowledged their separation from the agricultural calendar that governed the clean world. When spring rains came, they sang songs of gratitude for the fresh water. When winter winds howled, they told stories around their fires that kept hope alive through the darkest months. They had even developed their own understanding of the divine, a theology born of suffering and abandonment that differed markedly from the temple teachings they had once accepted without question. If God was love, they reasoned, then perhaps their exile was not punishment, but preparation for something greater. If the clean world rejected them, maybe that was because they were being prepared for a different kind of acceptance, a different kind of belonging. Some of the colony's most profound thinkers spoke of their condition as a form of prophecy made flesh, living reminders to the clean world of the fragility of health, status, and social position. They saw themselves as unwitting teachers, their very existence serving as lessons about compassion, humility, and the dangers of defining human worth by physical perfection. These philosophical discussions usually took place during the long evenings when work was done and the community gathered around their shared fire. The conversations ranged from the practical, how to improve their water collection, where to find the best scraps, to the eternal. What did it mean to be human when humanity itself seemed to reject you? How could you maintain dignity when society insisted you had none? What was the purpose of suffering that seemed to serve no greater good? The answers they found were not the ones taught in temples or written in sacred books. They were harder-won truths, forged in the crucible of absolute rejection, and tempered by years of learning to find meaning in meaninglessness. They discovered that dignity was not something others could grant or take away, but something that emerged from how you chose to face whatever circumstances life presented. They learned that purpose could be found in the smallest acts of kindness, the simplest gestures of human connection. And slowly, imperceptibly, Miriam realized that something extraordinary had happened. She had stopped mourning her old life. Oh, she still remembered it, still felt pangs of loss when certain memories surfaced. But the crushing grief that had once defined her existence had transformed into something else, a quiet acceptance, even a strange form of gratitude. She was grateful for the relationships she had formed with people she would never have met in the clean world. She was thankful for the depths of resilience she had discovered within herself. She appreciated the clarity that came from having all pretense stripped away, leaving only the essential business of being human in the face of impossible circumstances. Most surprisingly, she found herself grateful for the lessons in love that exile had taught her. Not the conditional love of normal society, where affection depended on beauty, health, and social usefulness, but something far more fundamental. The love that existed simply because consciousness recognized consciousness, because one suffering soul reached out to comfort another. This love was visible everywhere in the colony once you learned to see it. It was in the way the sighted guided the blind, how the able-bodied shared their strength with those too weak to work, how the lucid cared for those whose minds had been broken by isolation and disease. It was love stripped of all decoration and social nicety, reduced to its most basic elements: presence, attention, and the simple willingness to acknowledge another's worth, even when the world insisted they had none. As her final years approached, for even in exile, time moved forward and bodies failed, Miriam often found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this unlikely peace. The woman who had once wept for her lost marriage, her abandoned home, her savored connections, seemed like a stranger now. That woman had measured her worth by external standards, had found her identity in relationships and roles that could be taken away in an instant. This woman, this leper, this outcast, had learned to find worth in simply being alive, simply being present, simply being willing to extend whatever comfort she could to fellow travelers on the hard road of exile. She had discovered that being cast out from one form of community could lead to membership in another, smaller, stranger, but no less real for being built on the foundation of shared rejection. The last entry in our imaginary chronicle of Miriam's life finds her on a quiet evening, sitting by the colony's central fire, as she had done thousands of times before. Ruth, now a young woman herself, and showing the first signs of the condition that would never allow her to leave this place, is teaching new songs to the latest group of children to arrive. Samuel, ancient now and barely recognizable as human, still tells stories that blend memory with imagination, keeping alive the accumulated wisdom of their small civilization. The fire crackles and sparks rise towards stars that shine down on clean and unclean alike, making no distinction between the worthy and the rejected. In this moment, surrounded by the only family she has known for decades, Miriam understands something that would have seemed impossible during those first terrible nights of exile. She is home, not in the sense that the clean world understands home, a place of comfort and security and social connection, but home in the deeper sense of belonging, of being known and accepted completely, of having found her place in the vast mystery of existence. It is not the home she would have chosen, not the life she would have designed for herself, but it is hers, authentically and completely, in a way her old life never was. And as the fire burns low and the colony settles into sleep, as the familiar sounds of their small community create their nightly symphony of snores and whispers and gentle breathing, Miriam closes her eyes, knowing that tomorrow will bring the same challenges it always has. There will be new arrivals to comfort, practical problems to solve, the endless work of maintaining life at the margins of the world. But there will also be moments of unexpected beauty, flashes of connection that transcend their circumstances, reminders that, even here, especially here, the human capacity for hope and love and meaning-making continues to assert itself against all odds. The lepers of biblical times have long since turned to dust. Their names are forgotten, their stories untold, their suffering unrecorded in any official history. But their legacy lives on in every act of compassion shown to the marginalized, every gesture of inclusion offered to the excluded, every moment when someone looks past surface differences to recognize the fundamental humanity that connects us all. And now, dear friend, as our journey through these ancient shadows draws to a close, let the weight of their stories settle gently around you like a blanket. Let the fire of their resilience warm you as you drift towards sleep. For in remembering the forgotten, in honoring the cast out, in bearing witness to suffering, transformed into unexpected grace, we keep alive something essential about what it means to be human. The lepers called out their warnings to protect others from contamination. Tonight, let their voices call out across the centuries with a different message: that worth is not determined by perfection, that belonging is not limited to the accepted, and that even in the darkest exile, love finds a way to survive and flourish. Sleep well, and remember, you are never as alone as you think, never as forsaken as you fear. Somewhere in the margins, in the spaces between the approved and the proper, community waits for those brave enough to seek it.